Hi, everyone. Welcome to Love Isn't Always Black and White, Interracial Dating and Marriage panel. We have an awesome event lined up for you tonight, and it is a great collaboration between the Center for Diversity and Inclusion here at WashU, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Princeton University, as well as the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center. My name is Dr. Ariel Williams, and I'm the Training and Education Specialist here in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at WashU, and I'm very excited to present this event tonight. We're going to get started with bios about our panelists, and then I will turn it over to Brighid, our moderator. Or actually, before I do that, I have to do the land acknowledgement. So our land acknowledgement reads, before we begin today's event, I would like to formally acknowledge the land of the indigenous peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial, and specifically the Osage Nation, Otoe Missouri Nation, and Illinois Confederacy upon whose historical homeland our university is located. Washington University is a community of educators and learners from every corner of our globe and must acknowledge the land we currently occupy. We also recognize that given the format of our virtual event, we may have folks watching from many different places, including outside of the St. Louis area. So I encourage everyone to reflect upon the land you are on. All right, and so now we will do bios. So our first panelist is Randi Henderson, who is in her 5th season after being named the 3rd women's basketball coach in the program history on June 5th, 2017. Henderson guided the Bears to the UAA title in 2018-2019 as the team went 13-1 during conference play. In addition to that, her first time winning 20 games came in just her 2nd season, 2007-2008, when she engineered a 12-win turnaround from the previous year and vaulted the Cohawks to a 3rd place finish in the conference standings with a 20-8 mark. Co advanced to the league tournament final for the first time in program history while winning its first conference tournament game. Prior to arriving at Co, Henderson spent 1 season at Minnesota Morris, where she earned Upper Midwest Atlantic Conference Coach of the Year accolades. She directed the Cougars to a 16-10 record, including a 10-4 mark in league play to tie for 2nd in the standings. She graduated from Iowa in 2001 with a bachelor's degree in Health, Leisure, and Sports Studies. Henderson received a master's degree in Recreation and Sports Sciences at Ohio University in 2003. Henderson and her husband, Duez, reside in St. Louis with their 2 children, Harper and Ezekiel. Our next panelist is Duez Henderson, who enters his 3rd season as a full-time assistant women's basketball coach here at WashU, following 2 seasons as a part-time coach. Henderson is instrumental in skill development, practice planning, and game preparation for the Bears. Following his collegiate career, Henderson spent 6 years in German professional basketball ranks. During his 5-year playing career, he led the league in scoring and rebounding 4 times. Henderson served as a head coach for basketball club USC Leipzig in his final season in Germany. The Iowa graduate is also an owner of Henderson Basketball Training, in which he has had the privilege to train some prominent individuals in the basketball world, ranging from high school athletes all the way to NBA players. In addition, he serves as a director for Point Guard College and nationwide organization for training athletes in leadership, understanding the game, and player skill development. Our next panelist is Dr. Nance, who is at Villanova University. She currently serves as the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer. In her role, she is leading the newly created Presidential Task Force on Race, named Equitas, the Latin word for equity. Dr. Nance's Villanova career spans over 4 decades, during which time she has served as an administrator, teacher, scholar, activist, and support system for students, faculty, and staff at the university. Dr. Nance was the first Black tenure-track faculty member in the Department of Communication at Villanova, where she established an African-American rhetoric course and created the highly sought-after multicultural leadership course. Led by Dr. Nance, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion supports Villanova's continuing efforts to create a welcoming and diverse community at all levels, including students, faculty, administrators, and staff. And our last panelist for this evening is Tyler Cargill. He is currently a second-year chemical engineering Ph.D. student at WashU. He graduated from the University of Kansas with a bachelor's in chemical engineering, and the focus of his research is on identifying air pollution issues in St. Louis within the context of environmental racism. So we have some heavy hitters here tonight, and I will turn it over now to Brighid.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. It is a pleasure to be here with you this evening. So my name is Brighid Dwyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am representing Princeton University and the Difficult Dialogue National Resource Center. I am presently in southeastern Pennsylvania, which is on the Lenni-Lenape lands, and also recognize that folks in the Lenni-Lenape community are not just folks of the past, but also thriving members of our community today. So also want to provide that acknowledgement. So I'm excited to get this conversation started. And as I do, I wanted to just spend a moment talking about the Loving case, which is really sort of some background that brings us here together. I think initially when we had hoped to offer this event previously, we were hoping that it would be able to be in conjunction or closer in conjunction with the anniversary of celebrating that case, which would be in June. And so for those of you who are not as familiar with it, just wanted to give you a sense of the case. So the Loving v. Virginia was a Supreme Court case that struck down laws banning interracial marriage in the United States. The plaintiffs in the case were Richard and Mildred Loving, a white man and a Black woman whose marriage was deemed illegal according to Virginia state law. With the help of the ACLU, the Lovings appealed to the US Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously that so-called anti-miscegenation statuses were unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. The decision is often cited as a watershed moment in the dismantling of Jim Crow race laws. So that's some of the context that brings us here today, and it's so fitting that the plaintiffs in the case were the Lovings, right? And what a fortuitous name to be this watershed moment in this landmark case. So before we get to some of those deeper connections, I want to provide an opportunity for the panelists just to say a little bit more personally who they are, tell us a little bit more about yourselves, and specifically, as members of the community, oftentimes you're known in your primary roles as a coach or as a maybe even as a researcher or as a doc student, as a faculty member. Tell us a little bit more about one of your favorite things to do outside of work, something that gives you a little more that wholeness of who you are as humans. So let's start off with Randi and Duez. But Randi first.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Randi. Something I like to do outside of work. Well, I have a almost four and just turned 5-year-old, and they occupy pretty much all of our extra time right now. So there's a lot of tag, kickball. We've had some vicious 2-on-2 games. We like to take them swimming. And if I were to pick like a personal thing that I do, I think I love going on long bike rides. And I just started getting into hot yoga.
Thanks so much. Hey, Duez, what about you?
Yeah, hey, welcome everyone. Duez Henderson. Thanks everyone for joining. Similar to Randi, I have a 5-year-old and an almost 4-year-old as well. And no, they do take up a lot of our time. It's fun. I love just hanging out with them. They definitely bring out the silly side of me, which if you know me in my professional space, I can be kind of straightforward and pretty serious in that. But Harper and Zeke are definitely able to bring out the silliness. I love being dad. Love just hanging out, having fun with them. Make some mean pancakes just about 2 Saturdays out of every month. So if you're ever around, feel free to drop by. But outside of that, I would say last 2 or 3 years, I've really gotten serious about getting better at golf. So I love to get out and golf. I can go and play with a group of friends that I always play with, but I also love just going by myself at times and enjoying that quiet time by myself. I've also listened to a few people a little bit older than me, and they told me that if I combine my kids and my golf game, then Randi is more likely to say yes when I ask to go and golf. So Harper and Zeke have some golf clubs, and I try to drag them along anytime I can as well.
Fun. That multitasking is real with young children. That's it. So, Dr. Nance, how about you?
That's a hard question, and I'm trying to think when I have free time. When I have free time, I realize that it actually is a hobby. Is that I started lifting weights. Yes, I'm a little old lady, and yes, I never did anything athletic in my life, and I just did 155 pounds. So you know, it's been a journey, and I realized that it is actually a hobby. So how about that? Seriously, so getting through the pandemic, it was the lifting weights, and the second thing was making bread. So I finally have conquered yeast. So I'm feeling good.
Excellent. Thanks so much. All right, Tyler, tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, most definitely. So Randi, I loved hearing that you said you love going on long bike rides. I too am an avid cyclist, so you'll often see me out on the streets of St. Louis riding my bike around. I've recently got into interior decorating. I'm hoping to maybe have a special on HGTV one day in the future. Nah, it won't happen. But I reupholstered a couch, and I'm really getting into redecorating my place. I'm really into language learning. I studied abroad in Tanzania in the past. So I speak Swahili, trying to find people that speak Swahili in the local St. Louis area. And lastly, recently got into Latin dancing. So I'm really big into bachata, trying to get salsa down. And just as a quick plug for events going on for Diversity Week, there is a Latin dance night today at 6:30 on WashU campus for those in attendance who want to go.
Nice. Very good. Well, thank you all. Thank you all so much, giving us a little more well-rounded picture of who you are and the fun side of who you are and what you like to do. I can't say that lifting weights is a hobby for me, but I do like a good bike ride, and I do lift weights upon occasion. So, and I've got children that are small too, so, but not that small. So there's a lot in common, it seems like. And I do love a good bachata as well. So glad that we got some commonalities here. Yeah. Well, again, so we're here to really talk about relationships, about some of the challenges that exist, some of the beautiful pieces about being in an interracial relationship. I'm the product of an interracial relationship. And I think it's been different for everybody, depending on the circumstances of where you live, where you grow up, the time in which you're in that relationship or that relationship began. And so, we'll jump in with just a general question of where and how did you meet your partner, and what made you say, for those of you who are married, this is my future long-term partner or spouse. And for those who aren't, what made you say, I'm interested in that person. And let's start with Terry, Dr. Nance.
Clearly, because I'm the oldest.
No.
And quite frankly, again, if you know me, I'm usually, I have my head down and I'm working. And my now husband was my office mate in graduate school. The year I came to, I got my PhD at Temple University in Philadelphia. And the year I came in, they had a ton of graduate students. They had so many that in order to decide offices, they just went according to the alphabet. My husband's last name is Moore and my last name is Nance. So we met via the alphabet. Now, in terms of, how crazy is this? I came in with a master's degree. So I was ready to teach, and my husband's specialty area was interpersonal communication. So back in those days, forgive the terms, they would pair a new graduate student with an old graduate student, and they would call the old graduate student the master teacher. And so my Kermit, that's my husband's name, not the frog, right? Because that would make me Miss Piggy, and I don't play that. So what? So Kermit was and so we're talking about these interpersonal concepts. We're talking about relationships all the time. We're talking about honesty. We're talking about trust. So what a great way to get to know people. And but in all honesty, he was my best friend. We sat, I don't know if anybody else, well, Tyler, you're doing this, Bridget. We were sitting there the first day in graduate school, and I'll conclude my story soon, sitting there going, and they were asking general questions and people were answering them. And we were sitting next to each other saying, how did they let us in this program? Everybody else here is so smart. I don't know anything. And of course, you know, at the end of the time, we finished and they didn't. So he was that kind of friend who was my support, helped me with my with the math involved in my social science degree in communication. Still to this day, he still double checks all my numbers. So that's how I met. So it was his ability to understand relationships, his name, his last name, and he is dynamite with a chi-square.
That's incredible. And I love that piece. Yes, what a great foundation to start a relationship, really talking about trust from the beginning. That's pretty phenomenal. So Duez, would you mind talking about how you and Randi met? And I imagine if it's anything like the way that, you know, my partner and I tell our stories, the story I tell is sometimes different than the story that he tells. So we'll start with Duez, and then Randi, we'll let you add in whatever else, Duez got wrong.
Definitely. We'll start with the factual version first, and then
I didn't
the
say that
entertaining version second here. So Randi and I, we both attended the University of Iowa at the same time. We crossed over for 3 years at the time. We both played basketball. People assumed that it was some love in basketball story where we were in the gym shooting together all throughout our college career and that deal, but pretty far from the truth right there. We actually met for the first time 11 years after we graduated from college. We met at the University of Iowa in the same arena that we played in at a charity game. And now, knowing what I know about Randi, not from a charity standpoint because she's very giving, but just from a publicity standpoint and being in front of people, I can't believe Randi was there because she's pretty reserved into herself at times. But so we're at this charity game, which was for a local neighborhood center, and it's many former Iowa athletes back, and we somehow end up on the same team. And during the game, like I'm joking with one of my other buddies that's there. It's like, man, that's Randi. I wonder what she's doing now. And, just kind of piquing some interest. And, during the game, I would make jokes at Randi, or I would make sure I passed her the ball more than other people, or I would set really good screens for her. And like all of these things are going on, and I just feel like I have no shot because they're going right over her head. So me being kind of shy and reserved as well, instead of approaching her after the game and it's like, hey, how you doing? Let's talk this and that. I go to the trusty old internet and I send her an email the next day with kind of a hilarious statistical breakdown of the game. That turned into, Randi was coaching college basketball at the time. That turned into me going to a few of her practices. At the time, I was also training one of the players that she was recruiting. So I invited her to a workout, and all of these things are just seemingly like going over her head until one day, this is probably about a month into like our communication via email, via text at the time. And I tell Randi, I said, hey, I think I have a crush. And Randi's response was, oh, that's nice. Who is it? So I think that's when I just really had to lay all the cards on the table and tell her it was her and that. But back to what I said, Randi is literally, she's a lot of fun. Like, she's literally my best friend. She's a lot of fun to be around, spontaneous, silly, but she has a heart for others and giving like no other. So easy choice for me once I was able to break down those walls.
Thanks for sharing that. Thanks so much. And all right, so Randi, then you get the final word on this. What did Duez get wrong? What needs to be corrected to the story?
I think unfortunately that was very accurate. I was definitely like, man, this guy's so interested in how well I'm coaching. I was maybe he was, I'm not sure, but I think he had a different agenda. And for me, one of the moments I was like, what is actually going on here is he had asked me to come to watch the kid that I was recruiting, her workout that he was doing. And I don't know if he did anything with her, but he did sit by me the entire hour of the workout and let his buddy do the training. So, I mean, I think I would say the same. Duez is my best friend. And, you know, something that has, for me, just so amazing about him is how strong he is, just as a person and his personality and who he is, his confidence. And as you can tell, he's a little jokester, but he has this great big smile that just really warms a room. So I think his persistence won me over, but we have a lot of fun together. So it was an easy yes for me as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing. So Tyler, what do you want to add to this conversation? Jump on in here.
Yeah, so I'll be giving a little bit of a different perspective because I currently am not in a relationship. So in the past, I was in an interracial relationship at my undergrad. So I met someone through the McNair Scholars Program, which is a program to try and help underrepresented students try and get to graduate school. And so in that program, I saw someone who was white passing. So in appearance, by race, primarily looked to be white. And that made me scratch my head. I was like, underrepresented program, someone white passing. I was like, I wonder what's going on here. So tried to reach out to that person and get to know them, and eventually started to vibe with them. And as my family would say, I started to realize they were good people. And yeah, we were in a relationship from there. And due to some of the stuff that I'll talk about from this conversation, we came through some challenges due to being in a interracial relationship, and ultimately we're not together anymore, but more primarily due to some other issues. But
great, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thanks for starting us off. So let's kind of turn that corner now and get into a little bit more of that meat, because things aren't always easy. So I mentioned I'm also the product of an interracial relationship. So my father is African American, my mother is white. And they were together they were married for 7 years, and they did end up getting a divorce. I think a range of different issues, but race may have been among them. That's not a conversation that I had the privilege of having with them before they left this earth. But it's not easy, right? It's not easy. I've been in interracial relationships myself. It's not easy. There's a lot of really difficult conversations that have to be had. So I'd like to ask you all, how do you talk, or how did you talk about race in your relationship? Tyler, are you willing to start this one off?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. The primary thing me and my former partner would talk about are kind of boundaries she would need to set with her friends and family, because a lot of the people in her life had not been too involved with Black people. So we knew they were going to be it's going to take some time for them to get to realize how to interact with me as I was getting to be more serious in that relationship. So there would be moments where you would hear friends use stereotypes that are related to the over-sexualization of Black men. You would hear, unfortunately, derogatory terms where like the N-word being used, and not even in like the hard ER sense, just like commonly how Black people use it, but her friends would try and use it as if they could. And like family members of hers were Trump supporters, and that would make me uncomfortable. just thinking about why, in fact, they are Trump supporters and is that affecting how they're looking at me? So these are all issues that I had to bring up to her. And fortunately, she was of the type where she would recognize that she would have to, in order to kind of meet my needs and what we needed in the relationship, she would have to be uncomfortable in addressing certain these things with her family and friends. So primarily just have to set those boundaries on what you're willing to sacrifice with your comfortability to try and make sure relationship wise, we would be well off in the future.
And Tyler, are you willing to say a little bit more? Again, want to respect the privacy of the person who's not here. But you said initially that this person is white passing. Now, do they identify as white, or were they white passing and had a different identity in terms of race?
Should explain that. Thank you. So on her mom's side is white, and dad's side, the heritage is Mexican. So mixed ethnicity, but white passing primarily. Like most people would see us and would think I was dating a white woman.
All right, let's go with Randi. Give us some insight on this. How do y'all talk about race in your relationship?
Well, I ask a lot of questions, and I think we just talk about it. I mean, it's a real thing that has to be talked about, and I think that we have communication in our relationship where if I do or say something that isn't correct, or isn't the right thing to think, or isn't something that I know correctly, Duez is very comfortable with telling me without, he remarkably doesn't get offended very often if I ask a question that is just maybe off or something. Sometimes he does say, maybe don't ask that question around other people, and I'll give you, the insight into what it is to be Black, or to hear that question, or but I think, we just had, I would say, a lot of conversations about a lot of different concepts, and including, I think now, how we're going to teach our children about race and what it is to be Black in this country. And so, yeah, I mean, I have been very fortunate. I've learned a ton from Duez and from the experiences we've shared together, but also my own research, reading, and asking questions.
Thank you. Duez, what would you add? Or what else would you like to say on this?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I've noticed, Randi and I, we kind of learn and communicate differently. I think we communicate very well, but I think it's differently. Randi is more of a, like, in the moment, like, I just noticed this, I'm going to ask this question right now. And then sometimes that may be where some of the, Randi, I get what you're saying, not right now, or like, like that kind of deal. So I think that's where a lot of that comes from. While me, on the other hand, I think I do I try to do a good job of observing and not getting caught in the moment, and then being able to almost take myself out of it at a later time and look at it from a different lens, or now I'll go and get clarity. Because Randi and I mean, our upbringing could not be any, more drastic and different. I'm from Detroit originally. Literally until, maybe high school, like, I had no consistent interaction with any white person at all, right? And obviously going to University of Iowa, that flipped and, was changed really quickly. And then Randi, on the other hand, being from Cedar Falls, Iowa, it was the exact, opposite on the other side of it. And it was really interesting. This was maybe 1.5 years, 2 years into us dating, and we went back to Detroit for Thanksgiving, which I have a really funny story, sidebar. My mom, she's a really good cook. She puts a lot into it, and she knows that I'm bringing Randi home for Thanksgiving. And she calls me one day, and it's like this, like my mom's pretty lighthearted, but it's almost like I could hear like this sense of almost like concern or panic. And she says, what should I cook for Thanksgiving? I'm like, the same thing you've been cooking for the last 40 years. Like, what's up? She's like, well, no, because Randy's coming. And I go, Ma, she's white. She's not an alien. She's going to eat what we eat, that kind of deal. But that trip to Detroit for Randy, and we talk about this, it comes up, from time to time. We were there 3 or 4 days, and maybe day 3 or 4, she realized, she says, hey, I've not seen another white person for 4 days. Like, I've never gone this long in my life. So, it's really drastic. And I think we bring very different perspectives to the table. But yeah, through Randy's question asking, through my kind of observations and comparisons, we're usually able to figure things out and work through things.
Okay. Thank you. All right, Terry.
Thank you. This conversation has been so interesting, and it's allowed me to go into so many different directions. And I would say that perhaps one of the most important things to understand is my husband and I are academics. Do we talk about race? Oh my gosh. We talk about race all the time. Yeah, so that there is talking about race, and, with the last James Baldwin book that we read in class together, and then there's living race. And so that there is a sense in which we always talk. There was never a time that we did not talk about race. And I can tell Randy and Duez, my kids, my gosh, they were so comfortable talking about race. Often I would get called into school because they were talking about stuff in their elementary school classrooms they shouldn't have been talking about. So, it's like that was going on. But I think then you move into the personal. And my husband comes from anybody familiar with Philadelphia, called Delco. And he was from a very white section of Delco. And so his parents weren't thrilled with the fact that he was dating me. They thought I was a lovely person, but please don't bring me to the house anymore. And he was estranged from his parents from a long time. Again, grandkids, once they got to look at those beautiful children, that was it. But so that consequently, I think when we did talk about race that wasn't academic, it was when we were together, and as a couple, we needed to negotiate safe spaces. So that I remember once, not once, many times, we would go into a restaurant in a certain area that we didn't know, and we would look at each other and go, maybe not him. Or if we were I remember on a boardwalk in Ocean City, and there was a group of people gathering, and we went, yeah, no. And then that non-verbal, later verbal conversation intensified when we had the kids, because we were always sussing out as we were. And I think if anyone thinks, well, I can just go anywhere I want, anytime I want. You don't live in the United States of America, right? Because that's just not true. So that there's a sense in which, as an interracial couple, you have to be on the same page with race and negotiating race together all the time, trying to figure out what spaces are good, what spaces are not, and that conversation has to be both verbal and nonverbal, so that there's real sense that you've got you've got your world, you've got your significant other's world, and then you've got to create your own world of understanding as you're moving forward. And nobody can tell you. All you have to do is just, because you got to live it, you got to breathe it, and then you go forward. There were vacations that we went on with when the kids weren't with us, where we would meet outright racists, and and that's when my husband would get very protective and very angry and start talking about white people and how he hated white people. This is my husband, right? But it was like this rage at injustice, and I think that sort of personalization of race happened for him in ways that maybe it didn't. That because I am from the minoritized identity didn't happen for me in the reverse. So we can talk about that a little bit more. Last thing I want to say is the intersection of class and race. In some ways, I was very much raised as a middle class Black person. My husband was raised as a working class white person, right? So there was a sense that I had gone to all white schools almost my entire life, so that I had been negotiating race very purposefully, for a very long time. My husband, for him, it was his social issue. He was, again, academic kind of guy. He looks like Fred Rogers, God bless him, with long curly hair. But these were his issues. This was his passion. But what was different was when it became personal. So I guess that's what, it was an interesting journey. It has been an interesting journey. And I think we still talk about race all the time because we can't not talk about it because it has survival value for us.
Right. Yeah. Oh, survival value. Look at that. That's deep. Yes. Thank you all for sharing on this. It's, I'm very much hearing this, this theme around making choices, right? And that decisions are challenging. I can even reflect about, my own mother was from Chicago and I grew up in California and purposely made the decision as a white woman to stay in California to raise her multiracial child in a location away from her family because there might be some less accepting views from her siblings or from her aunts or her uncles or her parents even about, the relationship she was in and even the child that she, myself, right, that she had. And it's interesting, Terry, you were talking about the places you can go and you can't go. And I think about that even still today, right? Like I imagine that was very different for you. You have children who are in their 30s now. But, I have children that are 13 to 7. And it's a different situation. Duez and Randi, you have 4 and 5. And depending on where you're traveling within the country, where you're traveling within your community, where you're traveling within your neighborhood, there are choices that you're going to make. And even thinking about child to child and how they're read in the world. And, do your children lighter or browner skinned and, things like that, right? So we can talk more about kids in a little bit. I want to get into a question that I think briefly came up. And I also want to encourage, folks who are here, to drop questions into the chat if you have them as well. I want to make sure incorporating questions that you all have for the panelists here. But was dating outside of your race taboo as far as your family? And I think that, Terry, you spoke to that a little bit in terms of, yes, that was true in terms of your husband. Were you willing to say a little bit more how it was from your perspective or from your family?
I'll segue and then I'll get back. Duez, you talked about taking Randi home for dinner. Well, Kermit came to visit me, and I have 6 brothers and sisters. I have 5 brothers and sisters, and our dinner tables were always very full because there were always assorted friends who would be there. And my father, the first time he met Kermit, referred to him as the light-skinned boy at the end of the table. So there was a sense that even my parents had a sense of humor about race. So that because my mom always called herself Black. When she passed away, we got to look at her birth certificate and found out that both of her parents were, in the parlance of Mississippi at the time, mulatto, right? So she was clearly biracial. In fact, my mother was lighter than my husband. So there was the way it was. It's like, of course, it was not going to, my mother's only expressed statement was, you realize this is not going to be easy. And that was it. And as I said, my husband's parents did not come to the wedding. and did not, they sent us a wedding gift though, but did not really acknowledge my son, my oldest son, until my second son was born. So that there was a journey for them. And that's really Kermit's story to tell, but it was not taboo within my family. I think it was, I did get a little pushback from some of my, and again, we all have friends who sort of fit on continuums. Yeah, so, you know, I had some pushback from some friends, but those people who really knew me, it was like, yeah. Does he have a degree? That's what she went for. So that's it.
Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing. Tyler, can you give us some insight into your family and your community? Was dating outside of your race considered taboo, or is it considered taboo?
It's not out of my taboo, or it wasn't out of my family's taboo, but I knew my family, my parents in particular, had a preference. So my parents are both Black, my grandparents are both Black, and my great-great-grandparents are both Black. And I knew in some sense they always wanted me to try and be, and still want me to this day, probably preferably to be with a Black woman. But they're always still accepting. They always tell me, Tyler, doesn't matter who you end up with, whether it be a white woman, a Black woman, a white man, Black man. Like, I'm heterosexual, but I'm just trying to let you know how accepting my parents are. But I could always tell they had that preference, especially when I start talking about people that I'm talking to. Like, you can notice the difference in their behavior. For example, if they start to notice that this particular person I'm talking to may be Black, they'll probably start asking more questions. They'll have a lot more energy in the conversation. So little things like that you start to pick up and you put in the back of your head that your parents do kind of want you to be in certain types of relationships. So I had to talk to my brother one day. I was like, he's 28, he's single as well. But I was like, do you think like our parents are almost pushing us? Do you feel that pressure to go toward a certain type of relationship? And he was like, yeah, man. He primarily brought up something that I found pretty interesting, talking about, for example, if we were to be with white women in the future, we would have children of probably lighter complexity. And then if they continue to do the same, then maybe further down the line, generations, like my last name being Cargill, would be tied in the past to having Black skin. But in the future, it could be something that gets whitewashed in the future. And that's something that is probably something I shouldn't worry about, because that's a lot of assumptions that I'm making, like what happens further down the line. But it's still always in the back of your head. And you just consider those things primarily. So there's no taboo on who I should end up being with, but there is some, I would say, the pressure that I feel in the back of my head all the time when I'm thinking about who I'll end up with in the future.
Yeah, thanks for that. And you're getting some emoji affirmations in the in people's pictures. It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. I've had with a colleague who used to work actually with Terry and myself, had a lot of conversations about this with this one particular colleague, and said, I worry that if I have a child with somebody who is white or lighter skinned, that all of their smarts and their attributes will be attributed to them being light skinned, or they're being closer or having more approximation to whiteness as opposed to their Blackness. And so that's something that this woman really wrestled with. And we need to re-engage that conversation, because she now has a child with a white man. But it's complicated and it's deep, right? And so I think that you're not alone in thinking about not just this individual impact, but this the legacy, because we know that the legacy of racism is one that is generational, that there's intergenerational trauma that is clearly linked to race. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that you're talking about it that way. Duez and Randi, talk to us about your families. Which one of you would like to share first? I see Duez unmuted.
I was passing the mic, but I'll take it. For me, I don't think it was taboo. It was different. It was new. And I think that created, some uneasiness, maybe questions, maybe assumptions or different just type of feelings at first. Just because, again, like I said, it was just different. I remember this was before my granddad passed a few years ago. Randy and I were sitting in his living room, and like I just kind of had like this epiphany. I said, Randy, I mean, my grandparents have lived here for 60 plus years, and you might be the first white person that's been in this house, right? So, I said, maybe outside of a insurance salesman or, someone like that, someone that wasn't, there for business or there for work. So it wasn't, I don't feel, taboo. No one has ever said anything. I've never gotten or felt like there were underlying feelings. I think early on it was just different. It was new. It was something that people hadn't experienced before. And I think this phrase is overused, and it sometimes gets under my skin when people say it, when people say, oh, I don't see race. But I think right now, just like with the type of person Randi is, the way I love her, the way my family has accepted her, the way she's accepted my family, like I literally don't even know if it like really crosses people's minds now unless they like really think about it or that kind of deal. So I would say that's where I fall, or my family falls on that spectrum.
For my family, I would say that it was not taboo. It had never happened before in any of our family or extended family. Like all of my cousins, anyone that I've ever known, like Duez said, I grew up in a pretty much all white community, and for most of our upbringing. And so it just didn't happen like there. So I don't think there was taboo. I think there was a lot of learning. My nieces and nephews asked questions. My oldest nephew, who'd probably be mortified to know I was saying these questions, he would say, did you come from, where did he ask if you were from South America? I think the only other Black person I've ever met was a basketball player that had played for his grandpa that was from South America. And Duez is like, no. And he's like, well, is your dad from South America? And he was like, no. And he's like, well, who's from South America? And Duez is like, I'm from Detroit. And my little niece, I know the first time that she saw him, she actually froze in the hallway and ran the other way, like just terrified, because it was like the first Black person that she had ever seen. So I think, but in terms of our family, my family, I think Duez would feel like, I don't think he ever felt any different. And I don't think anybody treated him any different. I don't think they were hard on me. I did have my late grandfather who passed away in his 90s, had, before I met Duez or had dated anyone, really dated anyone, but we had a conversation about race and dating, interracial marriage. And he had said that he would not suggest it because he knew there was going to be, marriage was hard as it was, and that the cultural differences would be really hard to get over. And so that happened before I met Duez, but.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. So, I know this came up a little bit. I'm going to go off the script in terms of questions in order that I sent the panelists ahead of time. Tyler, I'm not sure if you have children, but this is a question centered around children. And so, talk, if you're willing to say a little bit about how conversations about race have played out in your relationship with children. And I know that I think you all have, in particular, Dr. Nance, I think you've talked a little bit about this, as well, in terms of your kids talking and asking questions and saying things in the classroom. But what are those conversations like? What have they been like? What might you anticipate them being like? I'll leave it there. So, Dr. Nance, you want to start? Because I saw you nodding.
Oh my goodness, did we have conversations? One of the things that you need, when I keep talking, I've been on the same campus, which has been wonderful, as you heard, for 4 decades. So I knew, so the beginnings of so much happened while we were there. So the beginnings of the Africana Studies program happened, a very good friend who also happened to be from Cleveland, I'm from Cleveland. And so my boys, when they were 3 and 4, were going to Africana Studies programs, because I had to pick them up from school, and they didn't have a choice. They had to come to program. So they were hearing about the stories, and for them it was a narrative. It was a continuing narrative, and we purposely chose to send them to independent schools, specifically to a Quaker school. And for those of our friends who don't know, a Quaker is a religion. It's a progressive, liberal kind of religion. And it's one that stresses social awareness and social action. So that while we were having these conversations at home about race as identity, race as social issue, that was also going on in their classroom. So, very quick story. I went to pick up my youngest son, and he couldn't have been but in kindergarten. And I had a colleague with me, and the colleague was not used to having children. So he, in a very condescending way, said, "So, Jesse, what did you learn in school today?" And he said, "I learned Columbus wasn't a good guy." At which point my colleague says, "Well," and he looks at me, he says, "I really need to correct this. Now, it was the time, and perhaps the way that Columbus treated the Native Americans was consistent with the time." And my son, Jesse, looked at him and said, "Was he right or was he wrong?" And so that there was a sense that while we talked about issues of race, it was always tied into a value system of the ways in which you treat people and how you expect to be treated. And of course, that got more complicated as they began to read and think aloud. But the main point is, we had dinner together every single night. There was just, even when there was soccer and fencing and everything else, we had dinner together. And it was at those dinners that we would talk about all kinds of issues, but that's when we talked about race. Let me conclude with saying this. There came a time when we allowed the boys to fill out this, to tell us how they wanted to fill out the census, right? Rather than we would fill out the census. And they decided that they would both be Black, because as they understood the census, they felt as though that was going to be the best for the African American community that they identified with. That said, I have one child who is radically biracial. His significant other is biracial. Most of his immediate friend group, biracial kids, radically biracial. And I have another kid who's Black. Same gene pool, same kids, but in their own understanding of identity and race, they have come to very different conclusions. Last thing to say, God has a great sense of humor. The one who's got the lightest skin has my hair. The one who has the darkest skin has my husband's hair. That's all God. It's very, great sense of humor.
Yeah. Thanks, Terry. Thanks for sharing. So Randi and Duez. So Randi, you want to start this one off? Conversations about race.
Yeah, our kids are pretty young. And so I think I have tried to, and we have tried to do a lot of books with different kinds of people, different places, so it's not just race, it's also people with disabilities, and they're asking questions about, like, why is that person that way, or what happened to them, so that all of these things just become like, differences are okay. They're important, and they're part of our lives, and they're the part of the people that we care about, just like we're different. I think our kids just now started recognizing that there are more white people around than brown people in their schools. And so that has just started happening in the conversations that we've had. But we do a lot of reading at our house right now. We have a lot of different library trips with books on the history. We have Henry Box Brown, which is a great book about slavery. And it teaches them that that's a real thing. They can ask questions from that. And I think that has been a major way that we have started our kids in the conversation. Duez, you can add whatever.
Yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head with those, and we are, like Randi said, just getting to the point where they like start to recognize it, or if they're trying to describe someone, they may say light skin or dark skin. We have the little board game Guess Who, and that's one of Harper's favorite questions. Like, hey, is your person light skin or dark skin? And it's like, hey, light skin or dark skin can be different things, and that. So I would say we are just starting the journey of question asking, explaining difficult situations, and probably not far off, unfortunately, from them having some negative situations pop up surrounding it, where Randi and I are really going to have to pull up the britches and do some serious discussion and talking. But from a starting spot, I hope that the work that we're doing is intentional, and it puts them in a good starting space.
Great, thank you. Tyler, do you want to jump in here on anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I don't have kids, so I don't know what much I can say about that, but I can think about what I would say if or when I do have kids in the future. I think one of the biggest things I would let them know is to be intentional on thinking about how the space in which they're at will dictate the type of relationships they could potentially be having with people, and thinking about the diversity in those spaces. Because, for example, if I just relied primarily on me being at WashU to say I'm going to use that as a tool to try and be in a relationship with people, probably a bigger chance I'm going to end up being with a white person just due to the demographics of the space. So sometimes you really do have to kind of be choosy on where you're going to look for people, just to make sure you're giving everyone an equal chance on people that you can make connections with in the future. So just trying not to be selective and limiting your choice due to the geography that you're in. So thinking about race in that sense, race and geography, I would say.
Yeah, thanks for that. I wanted to go back just for a moment about the piece around education and young kids. And I think we're at such a moment where it's so fantastic. There is a whole new slate of books that exists for kids these days, where I think, there was so much that was more limited when I was growing up, and probably even, more for the generations, before myself. And now, it's interesting because I also find that many of the books are, when I was growing up, were, Roll of Thunder, Hear Me Cry, and like books that really were about slavery or Jim Crow, or kind of really, really tough times. And what I love seeing my kids read is books about, Black science fiction, and, things that really curate curiosity and joy and growth, and showing my kids that they can be any kind of Black or multiracial person that they identify as. And so, I think that's incredibly important. And, I also just wanted to give voice to, I recognize that I think that everyone who's been, part of this panel tonight is also referring to, heterosexual relationships, right? And we recognize that that is certainly not it. Certainly, interracial relationships can be same-sex relationships, and all kinds of relationships can be interracial. And so just want to give voice to that, that this is, I think just by happenstance, this is sort of where we ended up, but also really important to think about some of these other identities that are really salient in addition to race, because oftentimes we're not just, we're not just engaged in relationships around race, but there may be race and class. I think, Terry talked about race and location, right? Detroit or Iowa, there's so many different dynamics that come into place that I think are really important and complicate and complement, interracial relationships. So, so I think we'll go for just like maybe a few more minutes. I wanted to give our panelists an opportunity to share, whatever else is on your mind. What else do you feel like is really important that you want to share, whether it's related to specifically thinking about, the Loving case, whether it's thinking about, the challenges, the joy that you've experienced in your relationship, whether it's thinking about, your hope for the future, whatever it is that you feel like you just want to make sure that you share with our audience tonight, before we close out. And I'll let whoever is moved by the spirit can go ahead and start. I have done enough moderating.
I guess I'll go ahead and take it then. So one of the questions I was going to be asked is like, what's the biggest challenge that you had while being in an interracial relationship? And I think it was primarily due to family dynamics. So I'm my most authentic Black self, like around my immediate family and like most of my close friends who just happen to be Black. So like I do a little bit of code switching sometimes with how I talk around people just because of how I feel comfortable in a space. I may change up how I act. So when I was in a relationship, maybe my former partner saw a different side of me than she expected to see, like, for example, when she came over to meet my family. So it's already nerve-wracking enough for someone to try and make a good impression on family, and then add it to the fact that she probably saw a whole different side of me, like talking in ways that she wasn't used to, not understanding some of our interactions. She probably felt very uncomfortable in that space and just out of her element. And that could kind of make things difficult when it comes to like making connections with family. And that's really important for me for thinking about who I want to be with in the future, is that I'm going to need things like that to be fluid, because I can't have that tension between a partner and family. That's just too much stress. I can't deal with it. So that big cultural difference between families is really impactful. And I just wish people have to get comfortable with, unfortunately, being out of their element at times and just taking time to see whether or not they'll be able to adapt to the situation. So I think that's something that people need to know if they're going to be in an interracial relationship.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So appreciate that. Yeah.
I can share. I guess for me, I think that being in a interracial relationship or any relationship is about just conversation and not being afraid to have conversations and to ask questions about the things you don't know or you don't understand or you didn't realize. Even in this conversation today, like I have learned so many things that I didn't think about even before, that, like the concept of whitewashing, like that is like, my mind is just like, what? Right? Like that is a real concern that people should think about, right? The fact that they could eventually not have the same color of skin at all, or even white passing. Like I've never heard that term until today, but it makes so much sense to me. So I just really, I think being open to being wrong, being open to learning, and like the code switching is something that I can understand now that I wouldn't have understood had I not been in an interracial relationship. And even if it's not a dating relationship, we should all strive to have relationships with different people, right? Because it really opens your mind to differences in a way that makes you not have to make somebody feel uncomfortable for who they are. And so that would be it's been amazing for me. I'm a learner by nature, and the whole experience, I feel like, of being with Duez and the things that I've learned even from today have been phenomenal. So.
Great. Thank you, Randy.
For me, I relate this back to, a big part of my job as a coach is recruiting, student athletes. And any student athlete that I've talked to, I usually ask them if they're nervous about the recruiting process, and usually there's some yes in that. And I try to calm their nerves by saying, hey, you have multiple options. And I'm a firm believer in the more options that you have when making a decision for anything, the more likely you are to find a good fit for you, right? And I think that relates to the conversation that we're having today, because, as a basketball coach, I can sit down and have a great conversation with another basketball coach, but that conversation is going to be limited in scope. I can sit down and talk to an astronaut and have a great conversation, and it's probably going to open my eyes, and I'm going to learn things that I had no clue existed, absolutely zero, knowledge about. I think it's the same thing in interracial relationships. You are bringing, sometimes, not all the times, because the experiences can, be similar, but, Randy and my situation, we are bringing two totally different backgrounds together. We're bringing two totally different perspectives, to meet. And now not only do we get to mold that to figure out how we want to use each experience and each perspective to mold our life, but we also get to implement that into our kids' lives, right? So, I just think the mixture, the meeting of the two different worlds just has the ability to open many other doors, many eyes to things that may not, manifest itself in other situations. It's not the only way, but it is, something that I see as a benefit.
What an honor it's been. I have really nothing inspirational to say after those wonderful 4 comments. I'll just say, I was on a panel once talking about interracial relationships, and some students were asking questions, and they were very concerned about sort of the day-to-day in an interracial relationship, and how we talked about race and how we dealt with race. And I said, I'm more interested in who's picking up the kids, and who's going to do the grocery shopping. And, yes, we talk about race, but you also have to be in a good relationship. And I'm blessed. I have, we got married 17 years after loving in 1984. And I would say that as we've grown older together, it's been interesting to recognize the intersection of all of our identities, and that race is one of them. And it's been fascinating as we've traveled, as we've just gone through this journey, that I'm fortunate I married my best friend, and that we're all open to the variety of experiences that everybody talked about, but also just recognizing the importance of really working on the relationship. And that's probably the biggest key to success.
Thank you for that. And I'm actually gonna ask you one follow-up question, Terry. Were you all aware, were you and Kermit aware of loving, and what role did it play in your relationship, or, deciding to get married? Would you be willing to talk to us a little bit more about that?
It didn't play a role in our getting married. We were just, I was on a time schedule. I knew when I had to have my kids. I finished my dissertation, had a couple of years, then I had to have my kids.
Just like an academic parent. Yep.
And it had to fall on the semester breaks, which I did. Got one on the fall break and one in first beginning of summer break. I had it scheduled. But in what we did think about, Tyler just
for everybody out there, it doesn't always happen that way. You can't really predict how life is going to go.
No. But I would say what we were aware of is we traveled a lot. And when my husband finished his prelims, he decided to ride his bicycle from Philadelphia to Florida. And one of the things we talked about is how I could not go on that trip with him, because at that time, right, in the mid 80s, right, there were simply places we could not go. Just, in spite, loving was 67, there were still places where they were not cool with that. And we ended up in Florida, and even in Florida, there were spaces, because he rode his bicycle down, I flew down. that there were places, so we were constantly aware of when the law would be against us. And I think that was an awareness that my husband didn't have at the time, but that we developed, because, it's just that, So, but I did know about loving, and it was particularly important, given my family history, which I know about, that there were members of my family from the South who didn't marry, even though they produced children, and they didn't marry because they couldn't marry. So that's how loving influenced me.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Again, as someone who had a parent from two different races, but grew up in California, I'll admit that I didn't really know anything about loving until like within the last decade. And I think part of that is about time and my age, and part of it is also about my location. Again, I think there was more acceptance, and free love and interracial dating, out west where I grew up. So, I think it's really important for us to think about the history and the impact and the ways in which that law is not that old in the grand scheme of things, right? It is really not. And that is scary. That is really scary. And for those of you out there, if you've not seen the movie Loving, it is phenomenal. It is super interesting. It is engaging, and it left me in awe. Just knowing more about the story of what that couple went through. So I highly recommend it. Let's see, I think there was something else that I was going to add before I close this out. What was it going to be? I think it was just adding on to a lot of what we've already shared. So I think that there are so many different dynamics when you're thinking about interracial relationships. So I think a lot of what we discussed here is really, again, centered around sort of Black-white relationships, and not every relationship that is Black-white or white passing is the same. And interracial relationships that are Latinx and Asian are going to have a whole nother set of dynamics, right? And so I think that that's important for us to really consider, and thinking about the stereotypes that may or may not be present in some of those relationships, and some of the histories that may be present, and whether that's the legacies of anti-Asian hate or immigration sentiment that may exist, whether that's founded or unfounded. It plays a role in how folks are perceived in terms of their racial identity, and how that shows up on in our relationships. And so there's challenge and there is joy. And I'll talk just finally briefly about my own current relationship. So I'm partnered and married to somebody who is Nigerian, so identifies as Black. And so in some ways, that is not an interracial relationship. And in some ways it is, because I identify both as Black and as biracial. And I think that the pieces that we kind of talked a little bit about around colorism, I think are very real, and the ways that they play out in any kind of, I think, whether it's a same race relationship, people in your family can end up being different skin tones. Again, whether that's folks who have Latinx identity or Asian identity or white identity, right? There are just different skin tones. And so I think that colorism is also a real piece to consider and to navigate. Again, if we're thinking about sort of the next level of that relationship, not to say that all relationships end up in children, but whether it is thinking about children, or whether it's thinking about the way the relationship is navigated, if both partners have different kind of skin tones. So there's so many different dynamics. There are so many different ways we could continue to explore this journey. Dr. Williams, thank you for adding into the chat that yes, Netflix does have Loving. I don't know if that is going to be a featured event at some point at WashU, but it is fabulous. Totally support having some Netflix parties in there. But so I just want to end by thanking all of you for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure to meet some of you and to get to know others of you more in depth tonight. And so thank you for sharing your time, your talents, and very personal aspects of who you are and your relationship. So it's been just a joy to engage in this conversation. And thanks to everyone out there in the audience who was able to join us today. And Ariel, I'm not sure if you have audio. Are you able to, are there any kind of closing comments that you would like to add?
I do not have any closing comments.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and see you next time.
Thank you, Bridget.
You're welcome.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Bridget. Nice
You're
meeting
welcome.
everybody.
Yeah, nice to see you all.
Bye.
Ariel, I'm going to push record to the cloud. Is that right?